Hey everyone, it's Jim
And Charles
from Valves and More, an online vintage tube store. And today in Tube Lab number 199, wow, we're almost at 200.
Yeah, just one away.
And we've got some fun stuff planned for the 200th episode next week, including a flash sale. And I think we're going to drop in and look at a new line, briefly drop in and look at a new line of kit amps as well.
Yeah, we're going to show you what we've been working on in secret here for a while.
So today, topic is power tube substitution. And it's a big, in-depth topic, but we're going to do an overview. So we're not going to get into every detail imaginable.
We'll try not to put you to sleep.
But it's a really important topic. So let's get going. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. When it comes to voltage gain tubes like the 6SN7 and 12AU7, there are a lot of variants out there, each with its own unique number, and the reason for that is they were universal twin triodes that could do many different tasks within a circuit. The same can't be said about audio power tubes. They have one specific purpose, which is to push current in an output stage and drive speakers, or some other device that requires current. So what that means is there are very few variants. If your amp requires an EL34, then you need to find a good EL34. Or 6CA7, which is just the US number for the EL34. Same tube. Yes, there is a drop-in replacement called the KT77, but it's actually not really a pentode, like all EL34s are. But
it's a beam-powered tetrode.
Yeah, so a lot of substitutions that will work were manufacturers' ways and means of getting around patents. So Philips and Muller developed the EL34 along with hundreds of other types of tubes. They, in the second tube era, the post radio receiving tube era, Philips Muller were one of the, if not the largest companies, largest R&D development. Though other people did do development work, they were certainly up there among the top. So it's not surprising that a very high demand, very popular power tube like the EL34 would have a company like
Marconi Osram over in the UK. So they designed the KT77 to be an EL34 while also not being an EL34 patent-wise.
Yeah. So that's how you end up with a drop-in replacement that's in EL34, but not really an EL34. So it's going to work electrically, but it will sound different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today, we're going to show you how to go about checking to see if a particular tube is a good candidate as a substitute or not. As well, Charles has some examples of what works or doesn't and why. And like everything technical with tubes, it starts with
data sheets. Okay, so we're going to start off looking at one of the most popular power tubes out there, the KT88, and some different versions of it here. Now, KT just stands for kinkless tetrode, and it was actually a big development at the time.
Before they had kinkless, they had
kinky tetrodes, and not in a fun way.
Yeah, so the tube design and construction actually had a kink in the output.
Yeah.
Now, kinkless still has the kink. You can see it, but it's much reduced.
Yeah, so these were an improvement, and they put it right in the name of them, kinkless.
Oh, yeah.
So the KT88 is probably one of the most used high-powered power tubes out there, and it does have a near-direct version. We have, of course, a true vintage Svetlana KT88 right here, and we have its slightly lower-powered cousin, the 6550C. And these are very close to being the same tube. But there are some versions of the KT88 that are modern production that are actually much higher powered. So let's take a look at the data sheets. Here we have the original Genelex data sheet for the KT88. And we're going to start off just looking at the general maximum specs and the heater current required. So we can see that we need 1.6 amps of current on the heater. And we've got maximum plate and screen voltages of 800 and 600 respectively. And we can get about 35 watts of power. Although it does say that it can get an absolute maximum of 42, I assume that's pushing the tube to its absolute limit here. And we've got 230 milliamps of maximum cathode current. So let's keep those numbers in mind here, and let's take a look at the KT120. So what's a KT120? Well, it's essentially a KT88 that's modern production and it's designed to output higher power. And don't let this vintage looking Tungsol datasheet fool you. This is actually a modern data... Oh, we're losing focus. This is actually a modern datasheet that has been designed to look like the vintage one. And
so were there any vintage KT120s?
No vintage KT120s, no vintage KT150s, which is the even higher powered version we'll look at in a second here. But we can see that it's using 850 volts and 650 volts. And if I go, let me flip back to the front page here. And we're using slightly higher heater current. We've got 1.7 amps and up to possibly 1.95, up from 1.6 on the KT88. So it uses more heater current.
Now, why is heater current so important?
Well, it's not too big of an issue if you only have one tube, but usually you have 4 of them. And your filament transformer or your filament winding on your transformer will have a maximum current rating that has to be respected.
So basically, if the filament is within 10-15%, if your substitute tube is within 10-15% of the previous value,
and the transformer was designed to handle over that amount, then you're probably going to be fine with it. It's not for sure. It depends on the manufacturer. Some keep really, really tight margins on these things.
Yeah, I mean, we're the absolute opposite. I mean, we are almost always have our transformers and our switch modes that are powering up the kits are way overspec.
Yeah, we always try to have a healthy margin there because we just don't know what's going to happen in the future, and you don't want things to be too tight. Okay, so we know it uses more heater current, and along with that, we're actually pushing out a bit more cathode current. So we went up from 230 to 250 milliamps, and we've got a maximum of 60 watts output now. So that's quite a bit. Now the KT150 is the same idea. I won't show you the heater current here, but it is around 2 amps. And we've got the same slightly higher max voltage on the screen and plate. Higher output still, we're up to 70 watts now. And higher current, 275 milliamps. So if you put something like a KT150 in a spot designed for a KT88, it's going to draw up to 45 milliamps per tube more. And typically these are run in quads, so 45 times 4, you're looking at 180 more milliamps of current draw. And that is a lot. Chances are the transformer on whatever amp that you're using wasn't designed for it.
So that's both the power transformer and
the filament transformer.
And the output transformer.
And the output transformer. I mean, going from 30 to 40 watts up to 70, it's probably not going to handle it.
So what happens if you overpower one or all of the transformers?
Nothing good. If you're lucky, you blow a fuse.
If you're unlucky, the magic smoke starts billowing out your amp. And is your amp savable?
It depends, but...
Most likely not.
It depends on what's burnt. Yeah, if it's a transformer, then you're in real trouble.
Yeah.
So these are an example of... The KT120 and the KT150 are examples of tubes that are sort of equivalent, but you really have to design around them. And being that they're all modern production versions, the 120 and the 150, they tend to be less reliable than the older ones. So as we know, modern production power tubes tend to be less reliable in the long term compared to their vintage equivalents. And
we're not even talking about sonics.
And the higher power you go, the harder it is on the tube. So I wouldn't expect anything that is trying to push above a KT88 to be a very long-lived tube.
Now, something to keep in mind is that manufacturers, including us, are really careful to actually put in the specifications the exact tubes that can be substituted.
Yeah.
And every manufacturer of tube gear wants to show you how many tubes are actually usable in the amp. So,
well, it's good for them, yeah.
It would be highly unlikely that that an amp manufacturer wouldn't actually tell you that you can use a KT88 and a 6550C, or you can use a KT 120 and a KT 150 safely. So the first thing you should do
is check with the manufacturer, see if they have it on their data sheet for the amp, see if they have it listed on the website. Typically, it's going to be emblazoned somewhere, obvious, so you can tell if it's compatible.
And what's the one thing you shouldn't do? Just plug in any old tube.
Yeah, well, that's a recipe for disaster there.
Yeah, and the reason why it's such an important thing to be careful about is that the vast majority of the cost of any amplifier is the iron, and the iron is your power transformer, your choke or chokes,
and your output transformer.
And your output transformer. You may even have a filament transformer separately in there, and
if any of those get damaged, then good luck finding it on a vintage one. Sometimes you can find new manufactured ones, but...
And one of the biggest problems with modern manufacturers is they're really not big on supplying replacement parts.
Yep.
You know, and...
oftentimes they're custom wound, and you just can't find them anywhere else.
Yeah, and which is really strange. I mean, when we design the kit amps, we design amps that are, we hope will be around 100 years from now.
And repairable then, yeah.
And repairable. So we don't use any magic parts. We don't sand off part numbers. Well, no, you're laughing, but it's a real thing. Manufacturers will actually protect IECs and transistors from copying by just literally sanding off the part number. Yeah. And then nobody publishes schematics, and we publish full schematics. So you know, some of the information you get when you're looking for a substitute, you'll have to go deep online and see if somebody knowledgeable, and you got to be careful about this because so Charles says let's move on. Okay, what's next, Charles?
All right, let's clear the deck and we'll be right back. Okay, so let's take a look at another kind of substitution that we can do. And that usually involves tubes with very similar specifications or ratings, but slightly different connectivity. So different bases, sometimes they'll have a top cap, but for the most part, they will work in the same circuits if you can adapt them. So let's start.
So electrically, they're identical or very close cousins to each other. But,
exactly.
But the actual construction of the tube is different.
Yeah, and sometimes it's for a different purpose. So over here we've got a Sylvania 6L6, and this is another power tube. It's a little lower powered compared to something like an EL34, and not quite as common, but they were still fairly common back in the day, and not very common these days to find a vintage 6L6. But you can take something like this beautiful Soviet-produced 6P7S, also called the 6BG6 in the American version, and you can adapt this. And what this is a 6L6 with a top cap.
Caution everyone, top caps can be very dangerous because they often are the plate connection or the high voltage connection.
So you'll have high voltage coming up to here, probably through a thin cable. So, you know,
with a ceramic connector.
Yeah, no running these around adventurous cats and babies. And
around children, top caps will require extreme caution.
Yeah. So they actually make adapters for these that will plug into the base here and change the pin out, because also the base pin out isn't quite the same, and give you a top cap connection, and then this will substitute in for a 6L6. And these are still available, and they're fantastic tubes. So that's one way that you can sub.
Yeah, those were made by Ulyanov, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think we still have some good inventory of new old stock.
Yeah, they're beautiful tubes. And here we have a vintage Sylvania 6V6. So this is the even lower powered cousin to the 6L6. Another very common power tube, and they were used in a lot of guitar amplifiers and small PA amps and things over time.
Back in the day, tabletop radios, car radios, truck radios.
And so what happens whenever you want to sub something in for a 6v6? Well, you can use something like a 6AQ5, which we don't have on screen. That's just a 7-pin tube. Or you can use something like a 9-pin 6P1P, another one that can be adapted over with a proper 9-pin to octal adapter designed for them. And this beautiful example is made by Svetlana. We've shown them before on screen.
You used them in your first headphone amp prototype design, and they sound absolutely stunning.
They're fantastic sounding tubes, and they actually have very similar ratings to a 6v6 GTA, I believe, but they can handle a lot of abuse. I think they're probably even higher rated than that. And so they're great tubes. So sometimes you can adapt over to a different bass, but sometimes your tube is just very different, but very close in the right circumstances. So let's clear the deck and go take a look at that. Okay, now these are two very different tubes here. Over on, I guess, your right, my left, we have a 300B. This is made by Electro Harmonix, but there are some beautiful vintage examples out there that are made by Western Electric.
Yeah, and unless you're wealthy, don't even think about Western Electric 300Bs. A match pair starts well into the multiple thousands.
They're probably one of the most expensive vintage power tubes that are out there. And the 300B is a directly heated power triode. So directly heated means that the heater and the cathode are actually the same component inside the tube.
And you can typically get about 8 watts in Class A absolute maximum, I think.
Mm-hmm. And over here we have a very different tube. This is the GU50, and we actually built a monoblock around this tube. And this was based off of a Telefunken design and then produced in Soviet Russia. And these are, I believe, transmitting pentodes. But interestingly, even though it's not directly heated, it's on a very different base compared to the 300B. And it's a pentode instead of a triode. If you triode strap this tube, it actually has almost the exact same characteristics as a 300B. So if you took a vintage 300B circuit and you couldn't find good 300B tubes, which, is not surprising considering the price of them.
Even modern production's very expensive.
Yep.
I can remember I found a bunch of these Electro Harmonix new old stocks. So that it was earlier production. And they sold instantly. I think I underpriced them, but they sold instantly.
Yeah. So if you can't find them and you want to build your own amp with something like a 300B, the GU50 is actually a fantastic option. You just have to account for the differences between them, such as not being directly heated, having a different filament voltage, a different base. But otherwise, once it's treated correctly, it will actually act just like a 300B and have similar output.
And the GU50 monoblocks are actually our main critical listening system.
Yep, we run them every day, and they sound fantastic.
Yeah. So we get the sonics of a 300B amp at a much, much more affordable price. Now, I think that probably the biggest difference between these tubes is really the appearance. This is a really sexy looking tube.
Oh yeah, everybody loves the ceramic base, the ST-shaped bottles. I mean, they're just classic looking.
These, on the other hand, have got to be the ugliest power tube ever invented.
Well, I really like the look of them personally, but, it's an acquired taste.
Well, when we're listening to music, we don't sit around staring at our monoblocks, do we?
Not all the time. They are pretty nice looking, though.
Especially since I still haven't put a finish on the plinths. But it's on my list to do.
Yeah.
So, anyways. Okay, so what else have you got for us?
Okay. Let's clear the deck and we'll be right back. Okay, last thing we're going to look at is direct replacements that are under a different name. So this is a really good example right here. We have a beautiful vintage black plate Sylvania EL84, also called the 6BQ5. That's the American designation. And these are just fantastic tubes. But finding tubes like these beautiful American-made EL84s is getting harder and harder. So what do we have as an option? Well, the Soviets made an equivalent tube called the 6P14P. So sometimes what you can do is you can find equivalents that were made in decent quantities from other countries and use them as a substitution. And just because it was made in the Soviet Union doesn't mean it's a bad tube. They made some fantastic tubes out there.
Yeah, and pro tip for Soviet era tubes, if there is a Dash EV or one of the higher spec types made, in many cases, especially with Chinese made amps, you need the higher spec version of the tube because the Chinese have a habit, I would say it's a bad habit, of building amps to off-spec tubes that were made in China, and they almost always build to the higher spec. So, for example, the 6N1 is a Chinese direct copy of the Soviet
6N1P. Yeah.
But the 6N1P from the Soviet era won't work in a 6N1 amp. You need the 6N1P-EV. And with EL84s, I would suspect that you may be able to get the standard Soviet equivalent working, but I would highly recommend that you just simply go to the Dash EV version, which is the higher spec version.
Or the Dash K, which is, I believe, this one right here.
Yeah.
And they will be just a direct drop-in replacement. Same pins, same heater, very similar max ratings. Although the Soviets tended to set their rating numbers a little bit differently in their data sheets, for the most part they are going to be the same. So that's the other thing, or the other way that you can substitute things.
Yeah. Now, did the Soviets copy every Western tube type?
Not every type, but quite a few of them. And in some ways they didn't copy them, but they were given them, especially during the Second World War when they were set up by the US to be able to produce military tubes.
And they just simply continued, I think, that trend later on. They got, I think, so used to not actually doing a lot of the design work that they simply grabbed the tube off the shelf from the West and tore it apart and built their own version.
Well, the GU50 is a perfect example of that. This was produced off of a Telefunken design that they had captured during the Second World War.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody's 100% sure whether the Soviets first just simply used captured tubes and equipment, or if they actually started manufacturing pretty early their own copy. But eventually they had their own production in quantity of their own version. And the tubes are quite a bit different. And of course, like many copies of vintage tubes, often the manufacturer copying will look at how they can improve things.
So they weren't just making an inferior clone. They often made them better in some ways.
Yeah, which is too bad because modern tubes, in many cases, are actually inferior clones. We actually had somebody commenting on one of our videos that we did about a month ago, I think, in which I talked about how many modern amps are supplied with pretty much crappy tubes. I don't remember the exact wording, but that was in general what I was saying. And the comment was, bullshit. And I always laugh at that because one of the things that we really work hard at is only talking about things that we actually know.
Yeah.
Or understand to be true, or are really quite certain about. And what is our number one complaint? We get emails from customers and from interested parties around the world every day of the week, 7 days a week, and we answer them all. And what's the number one complaint we get, Charles? From
my modern tubes don't sound good in some way, and most of the time they're harsh. The top end sounds terrible.
My power tubes lasted 2 months and started dying.
Yeah.
So, and there's variations on this. How come my stock tubes sound so bad?
Yeah.
Or how come my stock tubes haven't lasted long? We see those comments constantly, and we supply a vintage replacement if we have one available. A lot of modern amps, unfortunately, there's no available vintage tube for.
Well, like the KT120 and the KT150, it was, if the amp wasn't designed to take a KT88, then you're stuck with a modern tube and what that entails.
Yeah. So, and then we'll get a comment back after we send out the the vintage equivalent tube, and it's like, wow.
I can't believe the difference this made. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and sometimes we continue to get comments from the same customer year after year about tubes we supplied. Oh, it's still going 3 years on, and wow, those power tubes from China lasted 2 months, and your vintage tubes are lasting 3 years.
Yep.
So, now that's not always the case, but it's really nice to see people commenting about that.
Yeah. Now, I mean, that isn't a blanket rule. It is possible for people to make a good quality tube out there. It's just in our experience, the vast majority, especially the stuff that's being included with new production amps, just is not the top quality stuff out there.
And it's not surprising because tubes are very expensive, and high quality tubes, even modern production, are very expensive. So if manufacturers want to keep their price point down at retail,
and they want to include tubes, then they're not going to include the best ones.
No. Let's qualify what we just said.
They're probably not going to include the best ones.
So let's qualify what we just said, because people really like qualifiers, or at least some of the people who like to comment on our videos. Does that mean that every single modern amp that's ever been sold in the last 24 years has been supplied with garbage tubes?
No,
No.
absolutely not.
No. In fact, quite a few modern amps actually are built around an available vintage tube and are supplied like that. Now, does that mean that every single vintage tube's a good sounding, reliable tube?
Also no.
No.
But generally, they do have a better chance of being a good sounding tube.
Now, do we make a point of selling only good sounding, reliable tubes?
Yeah, we try to.
We try to. Do we always get it right? No. But we try hard.
Yeah.
So, there. I think we've qualified.
Yeah, just about everything here.
Okay, well, if you stayed till... Oh, we actually have something to show off that we've got stock of that's quite a rare power tube. Well, let's clear the decks and get it up. So we were just talking about substitutions of tubes. What about if you can get your hands on the real deal, a real vintage EL34? In this case, this is the SED. So that SED is Svetlana Electronic Devices, or commonly people call them SVETs. This is the real St. Petersburg EL34. There's caution, folks. Can you get it on camera?
There we go.
There are copies of this tube out there that look almost the same. Charles is brilliant at spotting the differences, but the
most obvious difference right away is just these tines that are right here. If they have the same tines on both sides, it's a copy.
Yeah. So, but these Svet EL34s, these vintage ones, are wonderful sounding tubes. If you're looking for a warm EL34 sound that's close to the Mullard XF2, which is the gold standard, nothing sounds like the Mullards, and we specialize in these and in the Mullards and the RFTs. There are by far our favorite vintage EL34. Well, any EL34 ever made. But if you can't stretch your budget to the Mullards, then the Svetlanas for a warm mid-range
are a very close second.
Yeah, and the RFTs, which I think we've already told people will be in the flash sale.
Yep.
Are I would say the equivalent of the Svetlanas is being second best to the Mullards, but they're a little bit more detailed.
Yeah, they're sort of on the other range. So they're about a second on the detail to the Mullards, while these are about a second on a warmth to the Mullards.
Yeah, in fact, actually, I think the RFTs have such great detail that they challenge the Mullards on that one segment sonically. The Mullards beat everybody for a warm, rich sound. There's just nothing like them. So anyways, we've got some quads of these Svets in, and they're becoming really hard to find. Power tubes in general are going to get, particularly vintage power tubes, are going to get harder and harder to find because they don't last nearly as long as preamp tubes.
I wonder if people are getting tired of us saying that.
Yeah, well,
we have to keep reminding.
I think it's important to remind people, and we've got a couple of labels here, so that's always instructive to look at. So this, for a long time, what's known as the winged... Can you see it on camera? I think so.
Let me get one of them up close here.
The winged or flying C was... for a long time, the Svetlana logo, though they had a number of different types of that and a number of types of this stylized S. So here it is. This is sort of an Art Deco S. And Svetlana ended up in a lawsuit, believe it or not, in the U.S. And it's online. It's really quite interesting. An audiophile reviewer, I think, put it up there and did a write-up about this. But anyway, Svetlana essentially lost the rights to use their Wing C or Flying C logo in the U.S., which basically met in the West. And they ended up switching over to, I think, a logo that they had used prior to that, and that's the stylized S. So are these different tubes? No, they're just different labels. And when you see this on a modern EO34 made by Svetlana, you know that actually this is post-lawsuit because they have to get out of their old logo. Can you imagine losing the rights to your own logo? Anyways, it's just ridiculous, the kind of things that went on. And of course, the reason they lost the rights to the logo is that there's a modern manufactured version of this tube that bought up the rights, the U.S. rights to it. And I'm not going to comment about what I think about that kind of stuff, but I think you can probably figure out what I think. Anyways, we've got some quads of these new old stock in store, which is really a treat. So, and if you stayed all the way to the very end, here's some discount codes to help you out. There's a secret code that quite a few people have been grabbing. Costs us big money. But if you see this and you use the code, grab it, because we always like to see people using the Cheers codes. It means that you're watching the videos or that you're a returning customer. And we can reach almost everybody around the world with flat rate $20 shipping. If you're in a difficult region to ship to, an island nation in particular, the Philippines is a bad one, but a large part of Asia is the same way. India is a big problem. Give us a shout before you order, and we'll see if we can actually reach you for a flat rate 20. And for everybody else, if your order is $150 and more, after discount, the shipping's on us, folks. Stay safe, everyone. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.